Welcome to this, the first podcast of historians and their books. Today we'll be speaking with S.Paul O'Hara about his book, published in 2016, called Inventing the Pinkertons, or Spies, Sleuths, Mercenaries and Thugs, being a story of the nation's most famous and infamous detective agency. S.Paul O'Hara is Associate Professor of History at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he has been teaching since 2007. Paul's areas of expertise are modern US history and cultural and immigration history. He has a BA from the University of Minnesota and an MA and PhD from Indiana University, Bloomington. Between 1865 and 1937, Pinkerton's National Detective Agency was at the centre of countless conflicts between capital and labour, bandits and railroads, and strikers and state power. Some believed that the detectives were protecting society from dangerous criminal conspiracies. Others thought that armed Pinkertons were capital's tool to crush worker dissent. Yet the image of the Pinkerton detective also inspired romantic and sensationalist novels, reflecting shifting ideals of Victorian manhood and embodied a particular kind of rough frontier justice. Inventing the Pinkertons examines the evolution of the agency as a pivotal institution in the cultural history of American monopoly capitalism. Historian S.Paul O'Hara intertwines political, social and cultural history to reveal how Scottish-born founder Alan Pinkerton insinuated his way to power and influence as a purveyor of valuable and often wildly wrong intelligence in the Union cause. He later transformed his firm into a for-rent private army in the war of industry against labour. O'Hara argues that American capitalists used the Pinkertons to enforce new structures of economic and political order. Yet the infamy of the Pinkerton agent also gave critics and working communities a villain against which to frame their resistance to the new industrial order. Ultimately, Inventing the Pinkertons is a gripping look at how the histories of American capitalism, industrial folklore, and the nation-state converged. S.Paul O'Hara, welcome to this, the very first podcast of historians and their books. Let's start with you and your background first. How did you become interested in history, and when did you know you wanted to become a professional historian?
Well, thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it. I'm very happy to be here. I think when I was growing up, I was surrounded by interesting people who told very interesting stories. My grandfather would tell these fantastic tales. He grew up on a small farm and grew up in a farming family, and then flew fighter planes during World War II. I mean, just sort of these fascinating stories that he could weave. My grandmother and my great aunt would also tell these some fantastic tales of growing up in the Dust Bowl and having these huge dust storms roll in, right? And all these just tremendously fascinating tales. And I think I became enamored of the past by listening to these stories, the way they could tell these stories and being able to connect where I was living at the time with these tales about how this place used to be, and it just struck me even as a child that it felt like a kind of time travel, that I was able to time travel, right? I could stand in this place and imagine it because people were telling me how it used to be, and I think that idea of weaving together these tales just fascinated me. And from there, I think I became more interested in what further tales were, the sort of the deeper tales, the deeper stories. And then I think the key moment for me was, as a maybe teenager up through probably college, this realization that everyone's story is a family story, right? Everyone's experiences weaves together in this long tapestry. And I just became enamored with this idea of how these various stories connect together.
Did you have particularly good teachers at high school in history, people that motivated you and really also worked on that enthusiasm you had from your family?
I hate to say it, but probably not. I think I had what is pretty typical in the U.S. History education is a side gig for football coaches and athletic directors and people who do other things.
Right.
And it was very rote, and it was a lot of names and dates, which I'm still not very good at. And it was dry and dull. So it wasn't really history teaching that drew me into history. It was somewhere else, right? It was these other tales. I think what really scrambled my mind was going to college, taking a college history course. And there it all clicked together, right? Like, we can do all of this, that the names and dates matter, but it's how they connect, and it's weaving these stories and seeing this bigger picture and seeing the smaller picture. I think that's the key moment for me, when it all clicked together, and I saw how it's done well, and why it matters.
So what role did your parents play in encouraging you to pursue history? And was your family history and your Irish ancestry part of the reason why you became interested in researching the past? Did your parents tell you a lot about your ancestors?
I think they told me what they knew. And part of that was, it was all sort of cloaked in mystery, right? We knew little bits, but not a lot. And this is certainly, I'm just old enough where, all of the really great archives hadn't been digitized yet, right? So this information was hard to find. And so, there was some information, but not much. But there was certainly some idea. But I think in many ways, that lack of clarity, having interest in my own story, having interest in the story of the people who came before me, but not having a lot of details, made it all the more romantic. Then I could kind of connect anything. And so, knowing the history of westward migration, right? Because I grew up in a very small community on a very small farm in South Dakota, right? So I was out in the middle of the Great Plains, and so that history of westward migration was my history, and the history of American immigration was my history. My dad was a meat packer, right? He worked in a meat packing plant, so the history of American labor and American unions was my history. Some, not all, but some of my folk came from Ireland, right? So Irish history became my history. So in many ways, the family tales, but kind of the open-endedness of those family tales, made it possible for me to imagine these big, wide swaths of history. It wasn't just genealogy, right? It wasn't just tracing back my family. It was embracing the sort of the totality, right? Irish history is my history, and U.S. history is my history.
You mentioned in the preface to the book that your mother had taught you all the revolutionary Irish leaders.
Yes.
And also that your father kind of quipped that he'd worked hard as a meat packer only for you to end up writing a book about the Pinkertons, which is rather amusing.
It is, and to be fair to him, he meant that in a
good
very
way.
amusing way. So I think that it's strange, because in some ways the history I write, both of the Pinkertons and other histories that I've written, it's not where I started. I'm not really doing my own history. I'm not really doing my folk or my people. It's often an act of being an outsider, right? Sort of looking from the outside and seeing this big picture. And so in some ways, the history I'm writing, why I wrote the history of the Pinkertons, right? Coming from where I do, the Pinkertons are the opposite side in many ways, right? Like, I come from a small farming, labor meatpacking family, right? Why the Pinkertons? And I think that so my parents encouraged this when I was a kid, weaving together these tales, Irish tales and labor tales, and not family tales, but sort of the embracing this idea of knowing history and humoring me as I went further down this rabbit hole. I think part of what I learned in college, and then my parents accepted and embraced, was this idea of history as a kind of radical empathy, right? That it doesn't have to just be your tale. Understand what other people do too. Understand their histories. Understand their stories. That everyone's tale is a family tale, and everyone's families can connect together in these bigger themes. So I think that's part of what my father was getting at, right? Is that this is a long ways away from where you started, but it does connect together.
So when did your Irish ancestors first arrive in America, and were they famine refugees, immigrants of the Great Hunger from the 1840s and 50s?
Right. So having poked around a bit recently, because all this stuff is digitized and becomes so much easier to look through census records, I've been able to find some clarity and some numbers. And I have found those earliest ancestors, right? Those earliest immigrants. And of course, the tree is complicated, right? Because the different people come from different areas at different times, and there are a number of English immigrants, and there's a number of German immigrants, right? Sort of, and they come from a lot of different places. But the O'Hara line, right, and the O'Hara family name does go back to the 1847, and
Right.
which makes them that's the depth of the famine. I'm probably going to get the number on this wrong. I think it's great grandfather is Patrick O'Hara, and he's on the census records that he immigrates in 1847 at the age of 12.
Wow.
And just knowing what we know about what the famine looked like in 1847, what the coffin ships looked like, what that journey really entailed. It humbles me in remarkable ways to think about what that must have been like for a 12-year-old to encounter that kind of hunger, that kind of crisis, that kind of journey to sail across the Atlantic in a coffin ship in 1847 is deeply humbling.
So why was it that Cincinnati, Ohio, attracted so many Irish immigrants in the 1840s and 50s? I mean, was there more work there than other places, or was it because there was already an Irish community there?
Well, I think the story of Irish immigration, and it's really the story of almost all American immigration, certainly from the 1840s on, right? It's still the story of American immigration, is that they follow where the work is. They go where work is. And so, and that's part of the story, right? The other half of the story is this idea of chain migration, right? You go for work, but you also follow in the footsteps of those who went before you, and you find community, and you find neighborhoods, and you find a sense of community. And so the story for Cincinnati in the 19th century is the riverfront. Right. It sits on the Ohio River. Steamboats are going up and down the Ohio River. They're building steamboats, but there's also, right, sort of that riverfront. There's the stevedores on the riverfront, and that's where all the labor is, and there's always need for work along the riverfront in the 19th century, loading and unloading. And I think that's what draws them in originally. But then those neighborhoods that stretch along the Ohio River become key places for community and identity in the 19th century for the Irish, as it does in New York, as it does in Philadelphia, as it does in Chicago, as it does in smaller places like Butte, Montana. They go where the work is, but once they're there, they build something for themselves.
Well, it must have been hard because, I mean, initially the Protestant population of America was very anti-Catholic, and there would have been signs everywhere, advertisements in the newspapers for work that said no Irish need apply. Right. So I mean, as you say, they must have really worked on building networks, following in the footsteps of those that had managed to get work and make connections and so on and so forth. But it was obviously very hard when they first arrived because of the anti-Catholic sentiment.
In moving into deeply hostile places. And that's certainly the case in Cincinnati. That's certainly the case elsewhere as well. Right, it's not just following the work. It's building these communities because the outside society is so deeply hostile. And the paradox of that, which has always been the paradox of American immigration, is that on the one hand, that dominant American society wants the labor done, wants the work done, but doesn't want to see the work being done, doesn't want to see the people doing the work, doesn't want them to have, right, their own traditions, their own languages, their own churches, their own stores. And so that duality of immigration, but immigration into hostile places is certainly the case. And that's what makes these neighborhoods so tremendously important. But to be fair, one of the ways that the Irish, certainly in Cincinnati, and elsewhere as well, one of the ways they cope with this is not only creating their own communities to push back against that dominant society, but certainly on the riverfront in Cincinnati, they're also competing with free black labor for work, for space, for neighborhoods. And so there's a racialization of Irish immigration as well. And so the Irish in Cincinnati, as they do everywhere, carve out a space, not just of their own, but a space in between, where they're not Protestant, they're not middle class, they're not Victorian, but they do claim a certain working class ethnic whiteness that makes the politics in Cincinnati in particular, because this was an abolitionist town, kind of, but also connected to the southern labor markets. So the place of the Irish and where they fit in the 19th century is deeply complex.
Okay, Paul. So now changing tact, who are some of your favorite historians, and what was the last history book you bought and enjoyed?
Well, I think when it comes to historians, there's a process by which you build on the work of the historians before you, and they build on the work of the historians before them. So I think for me, much of how I think about history and how I've tried to do history really starts with the great revolutions in social history. Everything that got labeled new, right? The new social history and the new immigration history and the new labor history. These historians who really blasted apart what was left of this idea of American consensus, and that American society was basically one homogeneous mass. And these social historians dug deeper, and they found the fissures, and they found the cracks, and they found the people underneath, and they found the people on the edges. And they not only found them, but they listened to them. They found their voices, and they found their agency. And that was, for historians who followed like me, that was deeply empowering. That we could find these people, that we could find the edges and the contradiction, and we could find the pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit, and the fact that they didn't fit mattered. And so those key historians are the classic pantheon of social history. It's guys like E.P. Thompson, and Eric Hobsbawm, Herbert Gutman when it comes to American labor, David Montgomery when it comes to American labor, John Hyam when it comes to American immigration. These were tremendously influential historians, not just on me, but on generations of historians who have followed. Indeed, it's E.P. Thompson and his idea of process, that the English working class is made, that over time there's a process by which that class is made and makes itself, right? So the making of the English working class is a concept that I hold dear. Indeed, it's why I borrow that same kind of title, right? The ing, the process of making and inventing. I would say connected to that, I was also influenced by what's often referred to as the cultural turn. The historians and linguists and people who studied literature and art and culture who gave us all analytical tools on how to really think about the study of culture. That's Foucault and Frederick Jameson and Hayden White, James Scott, who talks about how we read power in hidden transcripts, Clifford Geertz and Joan Scott. These were all people who gave us all toolkits, the way in which we can really think about how to find that agency and how to read texts and how to read the process by which people build their lives in the places that they can. And so I think the key step for me was finding the models, the books where I read that use that social history, use that new labor history, use the cultural turn, the books that I read and was just blown away by, the books that I looked at and said, this is what I want to do. This is the kind of history I want to write. And the two that really stick out in my mind that I remember just thinking, this is the model that I want to follow. One was Carl Smith's book on Chicago. This is Urban Disorder and Shape of Belief. And the other is Amy Gilman Srebnick's book on antebellum New York, called The Mysterious Death of Mary Rogers. Both of these were just fantastic models of how you can do social history through cultural analysis.
I had the benefit of having very good teachers. At the undergraduate level, I got to work with David Roediger, who wrote The Wages of Whiteness when he was at Minnesota. I got to work with John Bodner in Indiana. And the answer to your second part of that question, which is the last book I bought and read and enjoyed, which is a tough question because I had to really think about this. There's a great new book. I'm not sure how new it is, but it's new to me, by Carl Jacobi. And it's called The Strange Career of William Ellis. And it is the story of William Ellis was born a slave in Texas at the very end of slavery, and he survives the Civil War and survives Reconstruction in Texas, but manages to completely reinvent himself, both in terms of not just race but nationality. And so he sort of invents a Mexican persona and becomes a tremendously successful Mexican businessman. And it's this amazing tale of an amazing guy, but it also represents these really fluid boundaries of race and class and nationality along this really fluid U.S.-Mexican border in the 19th century. And it's just an amazing, amazing tale.
I must look that book up.
It is great. It speaks to me because it's often what I try to do, which is take this very small story and tell it well, but also extrapolate out how this one small tale tells us something about the larger whole. So The Strange Career of William Ellis it comes highly recommended.
All right. So the question now is, what kind of historian are you, and how would you describe your particular historiographical approach?
I'm a cultural historian, I think, which is to say I'm interested in both American culture, but also cultural approaches to history, which is to say I'm interested in the way in which people rationalize to themselves, explain to themselves who they are and what they're doing, how they create these distinct categories of class, of race, of gender, of region and nationality, how these identities create political action, how they shape economic opportunities or lack of opportunities, that act of negotiating the self and negotiating groups and crafting it, right? Writing it. How do you write and argue and create this larger sense of self in this shifting world in the 19th century, in the 20th century, where all of the normal standards of class, of race, of work are collapsing and rebuilding. I'm deeply intrigued by this idea of social construction of identity, both individual identity and group identity. That's why I mentioned, right, the Irish in Cincinnati are negotiating this terrain where they're white but not quite white, and they're American but not quite American. They're right, sort of how they work and where they work and how they live and where they live, and how much Irishness do they get to maintain? How much do they have to lose? What does Americanization mean? I think these are the questions that cultural historians such as myself are intrigued by, exactly how these identities get negotiated. And I think you see a little bit in the book, right? Because it's not just what the Pinkertons do, but what they symbolize and how they can contort and change and reinvent what they symbolize.
Well, you've written 2 books. Are you currently writing or planning to write another book? Are you working on a project right now?
I have a couple of irons in the fire. What they will become, I'm not sure. But I'm still deeply intrigued by this period from 1870 through the turn of the 20th century, because I think so much of what is defined as American and what's defined as un-American or non-American in terms of race, in terms of region, is so deeply in flux. I'm intrigued by that folklore and the cultures of American capitalism and the cultures of immigration and the cultures of Victorianism, and how these regions that still define us, right? What does it mean to be Southern? What does it mean to be Appalachian? What does it mean to be Midwestern? What does it mean to be immigrant? What does it mean to be working class? All of that, I think, is being renegotiated and reinvented at the end of the 19th century. And so I'm intrigued by a lot of these different stories. Which ones will pan out, I'm not sure yet, but I'm definitely still exploring.
Okay, good. Well, I look forward to it because I've enjoyed both your books. Before we go into inventing the Pinkertons, my last question really you're a teacher of history. You have plenty of students to teach at Xavier University, I'm sure.
Yes.
And I'm sure you have people there in the marketing department that go out and try to recruit students in history. Right. And I'm just curious if you, it's not uncommon for academics to be invited from time to time to go out with the marketing and recruitment people to sell programs and sell history programs. So I'm just curious, what would be your key selling points for the discipline for young people today? Because, clearly history does matter, and it couldn't matter any more than it does right now in America with the current crisis and
that is precisely right.
The uprisings and so on and so forth. There's so much historical background that forms an undercurrent to all of what is going on, that to really be able to understand it, you need to know history.
I think that is exactly right, and that is often the sales pitch that we make. It doesn't always land on students' ears, and it doesn't always land on their parents, right, who are actually paying the tuition. Often there's a perception, and we see this again and again, worse over the past 5 years probably, that there's a perception that the question becomes, what are you going to do with your history major? And I think for a lot of the marketing folk, for a lot of advisors, for a lot of parents, the assumption is, well, you get a history degree to teach history, or you get a history degree and maybe you use it to go to law school. And I think that's missing exactly what the study of history can do. And so I think if I were to try and convince students of the value of history, I would do so in a couple of ways. First and foremost, there are essential skills that the study of history teaches. Historians look at big questions and then reformulate those big questions into smaller questions, and to think about what evidence and what explorations and what data can be used to explore those questions. How do you reframe those questions into even better questions? And then how do you gather evidence to start answering those questions? You gather a lot of information, you look at it in total, you prioritize it and categorize it and explain it, and you create an argument that helps explain things, and then you, as precisely and concisely as you can, explain it, right? You come up with an argument. These are job skills. These are job skills that all employers want, right? How to take a lot of information and condense it and explain it and explain the why, right? It's not just the when, it's not just the where, it's not just the who, it's why. And so I think part of the answer is for incoming freshmen or their parents who are worried about what history teaches, this is an essential skill. And I think the second answer, then the one that you've already talked about a bit, is that it's not just the skill of historical analysis, it's understanding context. Why is the history of policing and race relations and urban spaces and who controls those urban spaces, where does this come from? Where do these traditions come from? Where does this animosity and conflict come from? And there are both short-term answers, which is to say the militarization of policing since 2001, the urban renewal since 2005, right? So there are immediate answers. There are longer-term answers, right? If you want to understand modern American policing, look at Reconstruction, look at race relations during Reconstruction. And I think the study of history lets you understand the why, both that immediate, right? Here's what's happened in the past 10 years. Here's what's happened in the past 100 years. And you can layer those together and really get a full picture and just understand the world that exists around you, to really see it as it is, to understand why things exist the way they are. These are not just job skills; these are citizenship skills. This is a way to be a knowledgeable person in the world. You have to understand that world, and the only way to really understand the world is to understand how we got here. I think that would be my sales pitch. You have to understand why people do what they do, and the way to understand people is to know who they are and how we got here.
Okay, let's now dive into your wonderful book, Inventing the Pinkertons. Now, my first question regarding the book is, what was it about their story that inspired you to write a book about them?
I think that's twofold. And the answer I often give to this question, although it's still true, is that I was teaching, and I was teaching the American Survey, which almost all American colleges teach in almost the exact same way, which is to say, students come back in January, and we start the second half of the school year. You get a whole new bunch of students, and you start in 1865, and you start moving forward, and you cover everything. And there's a certain reason for that, right? Sort of, and coverage matters, and having that context matters. But I struggled because it's a brand new group of students, right? How can I get them invested in this? Because we need to talk about Reconstruction and the rise of the New South, but then we're going to shift and we're going to talk about the West, and then we're going to shift again and talk about industrialization and labor, and then we're going to talk about immigration, and then we're going to, right? We're moving in lots of different areas, and I'm going to lose them if I can't connect this all together. Right. How can I connect this together? And as I taught it year after year, I found myself using as not just the segue from section to section, right, but as connective tissues. The Pinkertons were everywhere, right? So the more I looked for them, the more I found them, right? So they're involved in trying to chase down Jesse James and enforcing Reconstruction politics in Missouri, but they're out in the West, and they're cracking down on resistance to railroads, and they're chasing squatters off of land, and they're enforcing the power of mine owners, and they're certainly involved in labor, right? They were everywhere. And so I started using them to help connect the various aspects of U.S. history from the 1860s through the turn of the century. And so the more I did that, the more intrigued I became of just what kind of agency was able to do this. How could they be in so many different places, doing so many different things? In some places they are deeply loathed. In other places they are deeply admired. How is a single agency able to be this different? How are they able to have their hands in so many different places, to be involved in so many different things, yet seem to always be in the background of every picture, right? Why are they not in the foreground? Why do we not know more about who these guys are if they seem to be everywhere and seem to be so instrumental? And so that's what led me to really wonder, as Butch Cassidy would ask, right? Like, who are these guys? And what are they doing? And why are they doing it? And so that's what led me to start this study.
I read somewhere that you compared them. You said that they were a bit like a 19th century Forrest Gump, turning up at all the pivotal moments in American history during the Gilded Age.
Right. That was a comparison. I think I made it. They're somewhere between sort of a 19th century Forrest Gump, because they're sort of always in the background and they're almost always messing things up. But they never pay the price for that, right? So they always end up a little bit better, a little bit more powerful. Yeah, they're always back there in the background. They're also, I think, in a very different way, it's sort of a Gilded Age godfather, right? Because this is a really powerful family business, right? Alan Pinkerton builds this thing. It's broad and it's sweeping and it has its secrets that no one wants to talk about. And there's this deep and profound tension as he tries to hand it over to his sons, and as his sons take it in very different directions. And this is what amazed me as I went into this, that I understood when I started, right, all the stuff that they were doing, or I thought I understood all the stuff that they were doing, right? I understood what their actions were. What amazed me the more I looked at it was it wasn't just their actions. There was a kind of literary or even cinematic quality to the Pinkertons, right? Everything they did and everything written about them, what they wrote about themselves, what critics wrote about them, it was all so profoundly melodramatic. The cultural stakes were so high about just defining, who the villain is and why they're the villain, or why they're the hero, or why, right? All of this stuff was so deeply cinematic that it seemed like it would make a good movie.
Well, tell us more about this extraordinary man, Alan Pinkerton, who he was and how he ended up in the US and how he accidentally fell into the detective business in the first place. I mean, he had many strings to his bow, didn't he?
He had absolutely so many different strings that seemingly have nothing to do with each other. Part of the problem with the biography of Alan Pinkerton is that most of what we know about Alan Pinkerton, we hear from Alan Pinkerton. And I think there's always a moment where we have to kind of question how much of this is true. And again, it's much like William Ellis, right? There's the slave in Texas. This is an era, and we have numerous examples of this. This is an era in which certain men get to reinvent themselves, get to create their own backstory and biography that fits whatever they want to be. And in many ways, Alan Pinkerton gets to create his own backstory. That's complicated. But what we know about him is that he's from Glasgow, Scotland. He grows up in Glasgow. He grows up in a very, very poor neighborhood in Glasgow, which is intriguing, knowing what he becomes. The fact that he grows up very poor. He's a Chartist as a young man, which is to say, this is working class radical politics in the 1840s in Great Britain, right? So he's a bit of a working class radical, and he's advocating for the political representation, right? He wants working men, especially artisans, right? So there are limits to the radicalism, right? He wants artisans and working men to have a political voice, and to be freed from the constraints that those ruling elites of Scotland and Great Britain have imposed. So he's a radical. British authorities start to crack down on the Chartists violently, and so he never says that he flees, right? He says he immigrates for more economic opportunity, but he also leaves town right before the big crackdown comes. So he's a bit of a political refugee, right. And part of him always carries that with him. So even in Illinois, he's quite proud of his working class background. He's quite proud of his Chartist background. He's an abolitionist. He's a fervent abolitionist. He claims to be friends with John Brown and other abolitionists. He says he's put off by Chicago and Illinois politics because it's not abolitionist enough. And so he's this very strange political creature. He's also a cooper, which is to say he's a barrel maker. And this is where we get into that story he weaves about himself. And so the story he likes to tell is that as a cooper, he needs particular kinds of wood. And so he's constantly looking for this kind of wood. And he's walking along the river one day, and he stumbles across what's clearly a counterfeiter's den. This is someone has carved out a place to make fake money, and he's offended by this. He goes to the local sheriff, tells the sheriff about this. The sheriff asks him to not only show me where this is, but help me catch these guys. And he does, and there's a reward, and he gets lauded. And he says, this is the moment when I make an important career decision. I leave coopering behind because I realize there's this desperate need for law and order to catch these criminals. There's a desperate need to impose some order, and I'm pretty good at it. And that's the moment, he says, when I decide to become a detective.
So he established his agency with a partner in Chicago. And what was the original name of his detective agency?
The Northwest Police Agency.
Right. And his partner was a silent partner, an active partner, or
silent partner.
Right.
I think he probably fronts a lot of the money. Is what happens, right? Because he's a Chicago lawyer, and that's where the story starts to shift a little bit, right? Because what the Northwest Police Agency is private police, right? So if he's not really providing law and order, because he does a little bit of work for the Chicago Police Department. He does a little bit of work for various sheriff's departments. But where the real money is businesses, right? Businesses hire him. Banks are interested in catching counterfeiters, so banks pay him. Railroads are interested in catching their employees stealing money, so they hire him, right? So what the Northwest Police Agency really is are private detectives, which is to say, businesses will hire him to catch people who they think are stealing from them. That's what the Northwest Police Agency starts to do.
You are listening to Historians and Their Books podcast, episode 1, my interview with S.Paul O'Hara on his new book, Inventing the Pinkertons, or Spies, Sleuths, Mercenaries and Thugs, being a story of the nation's most famous and infamous detective agency. Now, Paul, in 1856, Pinkerton hired a 23-year-old widow called Kate Warne, who would become America's first female detective. Talk to us a little bit about her, because Pinkerton was also known for employing ethnic minorities at the time as well. So, he was quite an innovator.
Absolutely. And so much of what we know about him and what his contemporaries know about him comes from what he wrote about himself. And so he was very proud of himself for doing this, right? And he puts it in all of his books that he was responsible for this. And part of that probably comes from his abolitionist background and his Chartist background. But I also think there was a certain level of pragmatism to these hires. Pinkerton fundamentally believed that the criminal mind was a flawed mind, that there was something wrong with the mind that leads one down a criminal road. And criminals would always out themselves, that they couldn't help it. They would somehow share, they would talk, they would do something that would lead to their own demise. You just had to be listening. You had to have someone nearby to listen. And that's what his detectives did. They would go into bars, they would join social clubs, they would just be around the people that they suspected, and hoping to catch them when they inevitably confessed. And Kate Wern, long before she comes mostly to fame because she's part of the effort to move Lincoln through Baltimore to avoid the assassination plot. But she's working for Pinkerton long before then. She's working on express cases, right? With the express agents who are stealing from the company. And the idea behind Wern is that she can enter people's houses much more easily. She can enter people's parlors much more easily. She can make friends with suspects' wives. She can listen to all kinds of new information. That the thinking being, people are going to share far more information with someone like Kate than they will with a man. And that's largely the purpose that she serves in the Pinkerton agency. And you're absolutely right that he takes the same basic idea and applies it more broadly. This is why he hires Charlie Siringo in the first place, right? He needs a cowboy in order to go out west and infiltrate cowboy gangs. He needs James McParland. He needs an Irishman to infiltrate the Molly Maguires in Pennsylvania. He needs people who will pass. He needs people who will be trusted. He needs people who will go unnoticed. And that's why he hires detectives such as Wern. The irony then being is that he's so proud of himself that these are people that will go undetected, that he lauds himself publicly, that he hires such people that will go undetected.
So I believe the agency also established the first database of criminals and outlaws and also created a logo that is now famous. So talk to us a bit about the database that the Pinkerton Detective Agency tried to set up and meaning of the Pinkerton logo.
So part of what happens is, and this happens immediately, right? Part of the reason why he goes into detective work is he's lauded for it, right? And he kind of likes the attention, I think, and he likes the praise, and so he starts to self-promote. And the more famous he becomes, the more clients he gets, right? The more businesses hire him. And so it becomes that act of self-promotion. And those are those key moments of name change, right? They drop the Northwest and it becomes Pinkerton's police agency. And then as he moves beyond Illinois, it becomes a national agency. And when he wants to stress they're not private police, but they're detectives, right? That's when it becomes a detective agency. So he's kind of reinventing what it is that he does. And in doing so, he's kind of inventing this idea of what a detective is. And for Pinkerton and for various other writers who are doing this as well, who are creating quite literally the literary genre of the detective, part of what Pinkerton is selling is his knowledge, right? He's a detective. So he's deeply knowledgeable. He understands the criminal mind. He understands the criminal impulses. He understands the criminal underworld, right? He knows who everyone is in Chicago. He knows what the connections are, right? He knows where they hang out and what they do and how they think, right? So this is what he's selling, right? He's selling knowledge. So if a Chicago bank fears that they're having their banknotes counterfeited, they go to him and he essentially promises, right, I know who does this. And if I don't know specifically who's counterfeiting, I know the networks in which they work, I can find him. And so one of the ways to really do this, to make good on these promises, is they start keeping records. They start keeping this database, right? It becomes known as the Rogues Gallery, where they keep information on everyone they suspect is a criminal. or involved in criminal activities, right? And they keep paperwork, and everything's connected together. And so what they can promise is that if you come to them with a problem, come to them with a crime, they already halfway to solving it because they have the database. And so it's this idea of knowledge. And that's where I think the logo becomes tremendously important, right? His logo is the open eye, the non-blinking eye. And this is a long-standing imagery, right? It's on the money. It shows up in Masonic circles. It's also a key part of pre-Civil War politics, right? There's this political organization within the Republican Party called the Wide Awakes, who use much of the same imagery. But the non-blinking eye is basically this promise of knowledge, right? We see what happens. We know what happens. And with the non-blinking eye comes that overarching slogan, "We never sleep," because that's what he's selling, right? He's selling diligence and knowledge and this ability to understand the criminal world in ways in which moral, upstanding, Victorian middle and upper classes don't and can't. He says, basically, you don't need to. I'll do this dirty work for you.
You quote in your footnotes Michel Foucault, who said surveillance should be considered a faceless gaze that transforms the entire social body into a field of vision. Thousands of eyes placed everywhere attentive and always alert, a long hierarchical network. I mean, that could have come straight out of a Pinkerton brochure or an adoring dime novel. I mean, it's downright scary, isn't it?
It is, yes. And I think in many ways it's designed to be scary because Pinkerton's always working both sides of the street, so to speak. On the one hand, this non-blinking eye, "we never sleep," is a sales pitch to potential clients, right? I understand this world. I understand the criminal mind. I have this huge database. I'll find whoever it is you want me to find. I'll find, and it's meant to be reassuring. If you're a bank owner or a railroad executive, or even if you're just reading about these stories in the safety of your parlor, you're deeply troubled, right? There's this criminal world. That whole south side of Chicago just terrifies you. You don't understand it. You don't even know the language. If you're worried about the world, the lack of order to the world, someone like Pinkerton says, "I can explain it to you, and I can control it for you." So on the one hand, that's reassuring to certain folk. On the other hand, it's meant to be deeply intimidating and terrifying to those who are being surveilled. There's always an authority watching. There's always an authority documenting, right? Be careful who you associate with. Be careful what you say. Because in any working class bar, in any union meeting, anywhere you might gather, someone there might be an agent, right? Someone's listening, someone's recording, someone's always watching what you do. And I think it is meant to be a surveillance state that is deeply terrifying and deeply worrisome. I think it's designed to be both.
Well, okay, after his early successes in the 1850s, particularly providing services to protect railroad shipments for Midwestern railway companies, Pinkerton enters the Civil War through a friendship with General George McClellan, no less.
Right.
During the war, Pinkerton serves as head of the Union Intelligence Service, which is the forerunner of the US Secret Service. Just talk to us a bit about this amazing chapter in Pinkerton history. What were Pinkerton agents actually doing on behalf of the Union when the war kicked off?
So he knows McClellan because he's worked for McClellan, right? McClellan had been a railroad executive. That's how he knows McClellan. So his first real introduction comes actually not through McClellan, it's the Baltimore plot, which is to say railroads feel responsible for getting Lincoln safely from Illinois to Washington for the inauguration, and they're worried about his safety, and they ask Pinkerton to be involved in keeping Lincoln safe. And as part of that, he claims to have uncovered there's a plot to assassinate Lincoln in Baltimore. And so he convinces the railroads and convinces Lincoln to abandon the plans. He's going to give a talk in Baltimore, but decide not to. He sneaks through Baltimore in the middle of the night to avoid this plot. And that really introduces him to the world of espionage and introduces him to Washington. But it's McClellan, right? He works for McClellan, and he provides intelligence for McClellan. First off, in Virginia, in Western Virginia, right? Sort of that initial campaign through the Shenandoah Valley, he's providing intelligence for McClellan, right? How many rebels are in front of us? Where are they? What's the sentiment, right? And so what Pinkerton is doing is he's sending agents into this area, right? They're pretending to be traveling businessmen. They're hanging out in bars. They're buying drinks and they're listening, and they're basically gauging sentiment. How many rebels are there? How's the feeling of secession? Who's willing to fight, and how many of them are there, right? So he's gathering that kind of information for McClellan.
Right.
When McClellan takes over the Army of the Potomac, Pinkerton comes with him and is providing intelligence for McClellan. And this is what makes wartime espionage so deeply inadequate. And Pinkerton is criticized for the rest of his life. The agency is criticized for much of the rest of its existence because critics say its wartime intelligence is so very, very lousy. Because it's disjointed and it's unplanned and decentralized. So Pinkerton claims that he is the head of a U.S. intelligence service. That's a self-aggrandizing claim. Such an agency never really exists. He's not the head of anything. He works for McClellan. McClellan pays him, and he gathers intelligence for McClellan. And this is especially important because he's loyal to McClellan, and so when McClellan gets fired, Pinkerton leaves too. He takes all of his files and leaves in a bit of a huff.
Well, of course, McClellan drove Lincoln nuts with his procrastination and hesitancy. Right. So, I mean, I think we all know that he was essentially a procrastinator, but, you've got to wonder whether his hesitation might have at least partly been the result of the poor quality intelligence he'd received from the Pinkerton agents, who had, as you say, wildly overestimated the Confederate troop numbers and supplies and movements.
I think there's no question that Pinkerton's intelligence is faulty, and Pinkerton's intelligence goes to McClellan, and that intelligence, which overestimates troop numbers, certainly feeds McClellan's his already existing tendencies toward hesitancy and procrastination. I think there's little doubt that Pinkerton's intelligence exacerbates McClellan's tendency to hesitate, and that's exactly what drives Lincoln nuts, and eventually leads to McClellan's departure. So Pinkerton had some success in Western Virginia, and what he would do is he would send gentlemen, in essence, into areas to gauge sentiment, and that worked in Western Virginia because, by and large, in Western Virginia, there wasn't much support for the Confederacy and wasn't much support for secession. And so they heard this and they reported that back. And this is how McClellan sweeps through. He tries to do the same thing once he's in Washington, right? His plan is, I'm going to send agents into Richmond. Once they're in Richmond, they're going to, again, hang out in bars and chat with people and kind of hear what they're thinking and gauge support that way. And this is tremendously unsuccessful because I think what happens is that his agents hanging out in Richmond hear a lot of bluster, right? Sort of the gentlemen hanging out in taverns in Richmond think very highly of themselves, think very highly of the Confederacy, think very highly of Lee and his defenses, and they're overestimating the power of the Confederacy. And that's what the agents are hearing. And that's what they're telling Pinkerton. And that's what Pinkerton is telling McClellan. And I think that kind of disconnect of not really thinking where this information is coming from leads to Pinkerton overestimating just what the strengths are of the folk in front of him.
Now, you referred to the Baltimore plot to assassinate Lincoln, which was in 1861. I mean, clearly that was one of Pinkerton's greatest PR triumphs, but I mean, it must be said the plot was vigorously disputed. I read in your book that Lincoln's long-time trusted bodyguard, Ward Hill Lamon, claimed the Baltimore plot was a fabrication cooked up to enhance the reputation of the agency. Do you have a view on the veracity or otherwise of the alleged plot?
That's a really hard question. On the one hand, I'm sympathetic to the idea that a plot foiled is hard to confirm, right? The fact that it didn't exist makes it hard to say whether or not it was going to exist. So on the one hand, Baltimore is certainly a hotbed of opposition. Maryland is a hotbed of opposition. There are crowds that attack Union soldiers as they try to march through. I mean, it's not a stretch to say there was deep animosity toward Lincoln and Union troops in Baltimore and in Maryland, and that's what they're hearing. And Pinkerton is not the only one who hears this. There are other folk who are also investigating and hear much the same thing. At the same time, I think what Pinkerton hears in Baltimore is the same thing he's going to hear in Richmond in the following years. He hears a lot of bluster, and he hears a lot of big claims. And I think he takes this bluster and claims at face value. So to get to your actual question, was there an organized plot? My best guess is probably not. Not in the way that Pinkerton laid it out, right? This vast, organized, up to the highest reaches of power in Baltimore, right? The police chief is supposed to be involved. There's the intricacies of this conspiracy, how broad it was, how deep it was, how high it reaches. The intricacies of it seem implausible. It certainly sounds like bluster and talk, and I think that was certainly Lamone's point, right? This is a lot of bluster, right? And it certainly is self-serving, right? The fact that Pinkerton can convince Lincoln to do this, then Pinkerton becomes the hero. This segues him into intelligence work in Washington. His intelligence work in Washington is a debacle, but his counterintelligence is pretty good, right? He's pretty good at uncovering Confederate spies. He makes a ton of money. And so, Pinkerton comes out pretty good from this plot, right? If he's looking to make a name for himself, a reputation for himself, it works. And his connection to Lincoln, he happens to just be standing near Lincoln on the Antietam battlefield, and they get their picture taken together.
Yeah, that's a great photograph.
And then this becomes so every Pinkerton office from 1870 through the 1960s has this picture, right? So you're absolutely right to say this is a PR coup, right? If there's someone concerned about creating an image and brand, foiling the plot to assassinate Lincoln is a gift. And in a weird sort of way, people doubt it, profoundly doubt it, until 1865. And in many ways, the best thing to happen to this story is the assassination of Lincoln. Because once Lincoln is assassinated, then everyone can believe, well, maybe these earlier plots might have been more true. And Pinkerton then say, as he does, right, this would have never happened had I been protected. Yeah. Because I'm the one who did protect him. And so it absolutely is. It's a gift for the Pinkerton PR machine.
All right. Well, then let's shift the focus to the end of the Civil War and the movement to the Midwest, where the Pinkertons become the kind of anti-heroes of the Midwest, hell-bent on, imposing justice on the unruly terrain and the Western banditry.
That's right.
Describes himself, the West, as a place peopled by the forger, the bruiser, the counterfeiter, the gambler, the garrotter, the prostitute, the robber, and the murderer. In short, a scene straight out of Deadwood, a nasty spreading disease that needed to be stamped out. Now, can you share with us some of the highlights of this chapter of their story? And I'm thinking particularly briefly of the Reno brothers, Jesse James, and of course Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, because clearly the Pinkertons had mixed results during this chapter of their story.
They really do.
But their exploits become the fodder of dime novels and eventually, of course, Hollywood movies.
Absolutely. And I think that quote that you just read, as we were discussing earlier, right? You can imagine a Victorian family, right, sitting in their parlor, right, reading that passage and just being fascinated and terrified and horrified and like, oh my, I'm sure glad that there's someone out there controlling these guys, right? It's definitely that sort of that horror, that fascinating horror. So yeah, they shift to the West, and this is primarily at the request of railroad companies. Pinkerton had been working for railroad companies for a very long time, and express companies, right? So that people who ship money. But in the 1850s, primarily the work that Pinkerton did for the railroads was policing their employees, right? There was a fear that employees were stealing from the railroad, right? They were pocketing fees, or express company employees were opening packages and taking money out, right? It was primarily about the employees of the company. That changes with the Reno brothers, because the Reno brothers are an outlaw gang who rob trains, right? They stop the train and rob it. And that becomes a very different form of detective work, right? The detective work in the 1850s meant someone stole this express money. We need to figure out who. And so there's a certain mystery to it, right? And they send in undercover agents, and they listen, and this is where you get especially female Pinkerton agents, right, who will cozy up to the wives of suspects. They need to figure out who the criminal is. That's not the case with the Reno brothers, right? Everyone knows who it is, right? They rode up and stole it and rode away. It's not about figuring out who did it. It's figuring out how do we catch them and how do we punish them. And so this happens with the Reno brothers, and the Reno brothers are fairly unique because this is southern Indiana, and the Reno brothers are an outlaw gang in southern Indiana, but it's a Union state, and they're by and large Union veterans who had signed up for the bounty and then jumped. But it doesn't quite get entangled in southern politics yet. So the Reno brothers are sort of this outlaw gang, and Pinkerton tries to infiltrate the Reno gang the way he did everything. The way he sent agents into Richmond, the way he sent agents into West Virginia, the way he sent agents to cozy up to clerks. He sends an undercover agent, southern Indiana, and this doesn't work, right? These are small communities. Everyone knows who everyone is, and when a new guy shows up with a lot of money, right, plops down in the bar and starts buying drinks and says, "Hey, anyone know where the Reno brothers are?" Right? He stands out, so those normal methods just don't work, right? Pinkerton agents get killed, right? They don't survive this effort to infiltrate, and so Pinkerton shifts gears. He takes it personally, and the Pinkerton Detective Agency takes a sort of dark, kind of vigilante turn, and you see it in that description you just read, right? These are outlaws and criminals, and right, they're scum, and what do you do with these guys? You have to bring them to justice, however that happens. And local authorities, local sheriffs, state governments can't do it. And if they can't do it, then I have to do it. And if I have to do it outside what's defined as the legal boundaries, then that's still for the greater good. And so the Pinkertons chase down the Renos. And they do so in a lot of unique ways, right? So they'll kidnap them and take them into across state lines so that they can then arrest them. Sometimes they detain them. Many of them get mysteriously lynched by unknown bands of masked men, right? Everyone seems to know. Once the Pinkertons capture them, everyone seems to know where they're being held, and masked men show up and sort of take care of the justice for them. So the Reno chapter, and this is where you really get this bifurcation. If you fear the Renos and you fear what they represent, someone like Pinkerton comes in and takes care of them, right? Yes, they get lynched, but justice is done, right? A kind of frontier justice is done, and order's reestablished, if that's your take on the Renos. If you're a little afraid that the railroad basically hired their own agents to come in and murder people, then the Pinkerton Agency has a darker reputation for you. And so I think you definitely, the Renos are where you really get this separation into the Pinkertons being heroes for some and villains for others.
Whereas the James gang was really quite a different story altogether. I mean, not only were they never captured, which was probably one of the Pinkertons' most high-profile failures.
Absolutely.
But in many ways, the James gang were more like Confederate guerrillas who were continuing the Civil War, as it were, in the Midwest, continuing to battle against the Union. I mean, you point out that the Pinkertons seemed to not understand that the James gang were actually heroes in pro-Confederate post-war Indiana and Missouri.
That's right.
And that the conflict with the gang really had little to do with law and order, but was defined more by the animosities of the Civil War.
That is precisely right. And so the Reno brothers kind of lacked that much of that aspect, but post-war Missouri, everything's very much defined by the Civil War, and that different chapter of the Civil War, right? This was the guerrilla wars of the Missouri frontier, right, where these bandits had been and bushwhackers and guerrilla bands had been attacking each other, not just throughout the war, but really dating back to Bleeding Kansas. So there's this long tradition of resistance to authority and resistance to the politics of the Civil War. And Pinkerton does not understand that when he first arrives, right? He comes at the behest of the Express Company to track down the James Gang, and he pretty much assumes that that's going to work the same way it does with the Renos, that the Renos had their supporters, but by and large, much of southern Indiana was terrified of the Renos. That's not the case in Missouri. By and large, Missourians love Jesse James, and they love what he represents because he's that rebel who keeps fighting the Civil War, and the rebel who doesn't surrender, and that rebel who's fighting the Unionist Reconstructionist government. That's a layer of politics that Pinkerton probably doesn't understand, because he tries to do the same thing, right? He sends agents into town to kind of announce themselves to the local sheriff and then try and work their way into the local bar scene. And this is disastrous because the local sheriff supports James, right? And defends James because there's a Southern manhood involved and Southern resistance involved. And the more Pinkerton tries, and he does the same thing he'll do with the Renos, right? So he'll send more agents. He'll try to kidnap members of the gang. He'll try and ambush members of the gang. He tries to use that same playbook he's using in southern Indiana, but in Missouri he faces all the more resistance. Not only physical resistance, right? He can't track down the James Gang because no one will help him. No one trusts him. They're much more inclined to support the James Gang. But he's also losing the battle over optics, right? He's losing the public relations battle. Because the more power he exerts, the more he confirms what Missourians think, right? This is the Unionist government, and this is the railroad, and this is big business coming in and imposing violence upon us. And the more violence Pinkerton brings, the more he confirms that perception of who he is, and the harder it becomes to chase Jesse James down. And so the more Pinkerton does, the more popular James becomes.
Railroad company that had employed him, to get the James Gang, they sacked him because he had failed, and then he self-funded through the agency the second half of the attempt to get Jesse James and his gang, and that failed as well. So it really was a disaster for him.
Because he takes it personally. At some point, the railroad company says, "This isn't worth it. This is far more damaging to our name and reputation in business. It's just not worth it." But Pinkerton took it very, very seriously and took it very, very personally. And he vowed, right, I'm gonna track these guys down. And the fact that he couldn't, that he never could, I think hurt him deeply and very much shaped everything that followed. After Jesse James, the Pinkerton agency becomes ruthless in its tactics. It becomes ruthless in perception of how criminality works. It sees everything in terms of vast conspiracies, that criminals are embedded in this web of support from criminal classes, right? This whole area of Missouri, everyone's involved in the criminal conspiracy that supports Jesse James, and thus everyone is suspect. I think that becomes the way the Pinkerton agency thinks about not just Missouri, but it will come to shape how they think about the coal fields of Pennsylvania and the south side of Chicago and the steel mills of Homestead. They assume there aren't just criminals, there are whole cultures of criminality in which some criminals exist because they're fed by these dangerous classes.
We've talked about the Reno brothers. We've talked about the James Gang. Let's round off this question with the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid story. This is obviously another famous story of the West, which is full of mythology. So perhaps you'd like to talk to us about the role of the Pinkertons in this great chapter of American mythology.
So the third great outlaw case that the Pinkertons involved themselves in. After the Renos, and there's some success with the Renos, and the James Gang, and there's utter failure with the James Gang, the last of these is Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The difference with Butch Cassidy is that it comes so much later. It comes as the frontier is closing, not as it is opening. So southern Indiana in the 1860s, Missouri in the 1870s seemed lawless, fresh, new, unsettled places that law and order had to be imposed upon. That's not really the case in Wyoming, and much of the rest of the West in the 1890s. They weren't supposed to exist anymore, and so in one way, Butch Cassidy is a different story. Butch Cassidy is also tremendously romantic. He doesn't come with any of the baggage, that sort of Confederate guerrilla baggage that came with James. He was a dime novel hero. He was specially made for dime novels, up to the extent that the Sundance Kid isn't a Westerner, right? He grows up in Pennsylvania. He reads dime novels. He heads west to be specifically the kind of outlaw that he's read about in dime novels, right? So in some ways, by the 1890s, that folklore is folding in on itself. Dime novels are creating the kinds of outlaws who will become heroes of dime novels. They're a fascinating gang because of just how tremendously popular they are. Pinkerton, once again, is hired by the railroad to track them down. And much like the previous efforts to reinvent themselves, the effort to chase down Butch Cassidy and Sundance comes right in the wake of Homestead, comes right when Pinkerton press and public relations, right, their image is at its lowest. And in some ways, the agency hopes this is where they're going to fix it. They're going to redeem themselves by finally tracking down, by finally chasing down, by bringing law and order, by catching Butch Cassidy. And of course, they don't. They try to make some claims that they are unable to catch Butch Cassidy, but at least they stop the robberies. They get him on the run. But at the same time, not only is Butch Cassidy and Sundance hailed by Eastern dime novels and by Eastern audiences, not only are their exploits eaten up, in many ways, Butch Cassidy and Sundance and the whole gang not only thumb their nose at the Pinkertons, but embrace the celebrity, right? They stop in Fort Worth and have their picture taken, and then leave it there, right? They don't take it with them. They leave it in the store. There's a certain level of taunting, and that just creates a profound mythology around Butch Cassidy, right? So he never gets caught. Maybe he heads to New York, and he and Sundance enjoy New York while Pinkertons are still covering every square inch of the West. Maybe they head to South America. Maybe they reinvent themselves there. Maybe they start robbing banks there, right? Maybe they continue their outlaw ways. Maybe the frontier shuts down around them. It has nothing to do with the Pinkertons. There's just a groundswell of different mythologies surround these two, which is why they make such a good movie. They are such a romantic pair of dashing heroes that they are already, long before the 1960s, they are already perfectly made for film heroes.
And they ended up in Argentina and then later Bolivia, is that right?
That's right. And the Pinkertons still try to take credit for this, that they're still responsible for harassing them. They're still responsible for why they're on the run. But ultimately, it's the Bolivian army that tracks it down. It's the state. And that's the irony of the Pinkertons, right? Because they're supposed to do things better than the state. But it's agents of the state. Again, if you want to believe it, there's certainly those who will say that they continue to escape and they continue to thrive. But the irony is that it's actually the state that will do what the Pinkertons were unable to do.
You are listening to Historians and Their Books podcast, episode 1, my interview with S.Paul O'Hara on his new book, Inventing the Pinkertons, or Spies, Sleuths, Mercenaries and Thugs, being a story of the nation's most famous and infamous detective agency. Well, that's probably a good segue into the 1870s, the 1880s, and the 1890s, when, they evolved into armed mercenaries for American monopoly capitalism, where they become capital's private army.
Right.
What were some of the classic labour disputes that the Pinkertons were involved in. And I'm thinking kind of a brief overview of, say, the Molly Maguires in 1876, the Haymarket affair in 1886, and the Homestead strike in 1892. Perhaps you could just give us a brief summary of what the Pinkertons were up to in those three very, very famous labour cases.
So starting with the Molly Maguires, right? Because there is in the 1870s there's a labor strike, the long strike between the Reading and coal miners, and this creates a violence as almost every labor conflict did. But what's different about the Molly Maguires is that the president of the railroad hired Alan Pinkerton to basically uproot what they both considered to be a criminal conspiracy. That the violence happening in the coal fields couldn't possibly come from coal miners, because coal miners couldn't possibly be discontented with coal work, right? This violence has to come from somewhere else, and this violence has to be part of a criminal conspiracy, and this criminal conspiracy has to be tied to. They eventually decided it's Irishness, right? So Irish immigrants bring this criminal conspiracy of the Molly Maguires with them into the coal fields. And I think this is essential for Allen because he was an old Chartist and an old abolitionist. And I think he fundamentally believed in the idea of free labor, right? That the working man should be free from these constraints upon him. And I think what happens in the coal fields of Pennsylvania is that Alan Pinkerton is able to convince himself that he's not repressing the coal miners in Pennsylvania by helping the railroad, but he's actually freeing coal miners from these dangers of this criminal conspiracy, right? That he's not backtracking on his past as a working man. He'll say when he writes about this, right? So I'm a working man. I've always been a working man. I understand the working man better than anyone. I understood what was happening here. And so this is the way it's cast. I think there are also a couple of other key elements that go into the Molly Maguires. The first is there's a certain business logic. The railroad hires Pinkerton to find this conspiracy, right? They are paying him to find a conspiracy. It's his job to find a conspiracy, and so he finds a conspiracy, right? This is how he continues to be on the exactly. This is how he continues to be on the payroll. It's also probably not coincidental that uncovering the conspiracy of the Molly Maguires, reestablishing his reputation as a superb detective capable of uprooting criminal conspiracies and bringing people to justice. This happens right immediately in the wake of his failure to catch Jesse James. I think he needs a public relations win, considering how poorly he did with Jesse James. He needs to reinvent himself again, and being able to catch a cabal of Irish assassins and bring them to justice, I think is a key part of reestablishing what his business is. But in so doing, of course, it radically changes it, right? Because now he's directly involved in capital and labor issues, and that's a brand new ball game for the agency. So I think that gets established in 76. It gets reconfirmed with activities in the Great Strike of 1877, where the agency becomes now this chief tool for reestablishing order because there are these dangerous working class immigrant radicals, and that's an entirely new line. And that confirms again what the Pinkerton Agency is saying in 86 when there are the series of strikes for the 8-hour day and rallies, and these rallies that end up at the Haymarket rally, and there's a bomb thrown into the police ranks at Haymarket, and chaos descends. And so the Pinkertons get directly involved in Haymarket and the aftermath of Haymarket. Indeed, they're already involved because companies are hiring them to go into immigrant neighborhoods, to go into immigrant unions and listen, right? The surveillance state. They're documenting everything, right? And so there's already this anxiety about who the Pinkertons are, what purposes they serve, right? They're already loathed. And so working class newspapers, union newspapers, other presses vilify, right, who these Pinkertons are. And so the fact that the Pinkertons arrive to these rallies, the fact that they're so closely connected to the Chicago police, the fact that violence tends to follow where the Pinkertons go, creates for the working classes this idea that they're now capital's private army. But on the other hand, railroads and banks and now industry in southern Chicago and South Chicago want order reestablished. And so they hire the Pinkertons to bring order. And the way they bring order in Haymarket is the same way they bring order to the coal fields. They find a vast criminal conspiracy of immigrant radicals and uproot it, right? This is all German anarchists. And there's a cabal of German anarchists. If we can just find them, arrest them, execute them, right? It's all a conspiracy.
And of course, it was the Pinkerton agent's testimony that ended up causing how many of the Haymarket alleged bombers were hung almost immediately after the court case.
Right. I wish I could remember this number off the top of my head. I want to say 7, but yeah, it's Pinkerton testimony that links it all together. So yes, there are anarchists, and yes, they say a lot of crazy things, and yes, there's a labor union that doesn't much care for the Chicago police and the Pinkertons, and yes, there's unrest and criminality, and yes, there was a riot. It's the testimony of an undercover Pinkerton agent that links it all together. That paints this picture for the jury that this is all one big conspiracy. Whatever it is you're afraid of, this is what's happening.
And of course, 6 years later, the remaining incarcerated anarchists were set free.
They were, yes, and pardoned because the evidence was so weak, because the anarchists were essentially convicted for being anarchists and saying political things about anarchism without any real direct connection to the bombing. And that was pretty clear at the time, many, but it becomes even clearer later. What happens is, right, eventually, there's always this duality, right, of whether you think the Pinkertons are the good guys or the bad guys.
That's right.
If you think they're the good guys, then you believe this testimony. If you don't, you question that testimony. Part of what happens in the wake of Haymarket is that balance shifts, and far more people are inclined to distrust the testimony of Pinkerton detectives.
Whereas the Homestead strike of 1892, that really starts to shift in a major way perceptions of the Pinkertons in a negative light. Perhaps you'd like to just briefly talk to us about the Homestead strike. It was Andrew Carnegie.
Andrew Carnegie, yes. This is his mill. He's desperate to break the union and to renegotiate salaries. There's basically a standoff under the leadership of Frick. Carnegie essentially militarizes that plant, right? They build protective walls. They're gonna lay in for a siege, but they need replacement workers, and they need to get the replacement workers from wherever they're gathering them, and get them to the plant. And so this is the origins of the conflict. That Carnegie needs to keep his plant running. He needs to get replacement workers into the plant, but he's got to get through town. And he's got to get past the strikers to do so. And this had long been a problem of strikes in the 19th century, right? Violence between strikers and strike breakers, of how to get people into the plant. And so this is the origin of that Homestead violence. And so what Carnegie does is he hires armed Pinkerton guards to basically usher in those workers, and you usher them in by essentially breaking the crowd, right? By taking over the streets, being heavily armed, have a heavily armed presence, firing into the crowd if necessary, but to control those streets. And he hires the Pinkertons to do it. And that's sort of the story of Homestead. But to get to that, I think there are a couple of important shifts that happen in the Pinkerton Agency. From its origins, the Pinkerton Agency was always not two different companies, but two different divisions within the company. There were the detectives, and the detectives were kind of educated gentlemen who could pretend to be something they were not. They were actors, right? You hired them, and they went into these dark dens of criminality and got information for you. That was the detectives, and that's really what Allen wanted his agency to be. At the same time, there was a second division called the Protectives, and the Protectives were basically just security guards, right? They were sort of armed men who would protect property. So what happens in the 1880s, very importantly after the Molly Maguires the Pinkerton Agency has already started shifting toward protecting capital. Increasingly, Alan Pinkerton's sons start taking over the agency.
Yes.
And his sons start pushing more toward, we should do more with this protective service, right? This is a growth business. We could do more with this.
That's where the money is.
It's where the money is. That's exactly it. And his sons, not to get into their psychology, right? But Alan always had this tension where he grew up, working class in Glasgow. His sons don't, right? His sons grow up wealthy in Chicago, and they're deeply intermingled with the upper classes in Chicago. So I think they have fewer qualms. So by the early 90s, they've already made this move, right? Alan has given up the business. He's actually died by the early 1890s. This is now, right, his sons are taken over. And the big business is providing armed men. And critics would point out, right, increasingly, that database they've been keeping, right? They know who all the criminals are. That increasingly, what they use that database for is, this is how they round up armed men when they need armed men, right? They know who all the thugs are, and they know who will do violence for money. So they've already started doing this, right? By the 1890s, they're already deeply engaged in this business. And so what happens in Homestead is that barges come up the river with all these replacement workers. They are met at the shore by strikers, and violence ensues, right? This is a pitched battle between Pinkerton guards and strikers, and it's bloody, and it's violent, and it's chaotic, and it's really a dramatic moment. But in terms of the history of the Pinkertons, much as we saw with the pardoning of Haymarket bombers, is that by the 1890s, fewer and fewer people are willing to see the Pinkertons as the good guys in the story. There is outrage, and there is outrage not at the armed resistance of the strikers. There's not outrage about the town of Homestead. There's outrage that these armed guards hired by Pinkerton think they can just march through town. And right, so the outrage is, why does Carnegie get to hire and arm his own private army and take them across state lines? Why is that possible? Why do we allow this? And so that's the outrage that follows Homestead. This is a debacle for the agency, not only because they get defeated, and not only because Pinkerton agents die, but there's public outrage. And that public outrage reaches a crescendo where there's finally political outrage, that Congress launches investigations. Congress determines this is a terrible idea to let private companies hire and arm their own agencies and their own armies. And so that's really the first time when not just public sentiment, but political sentiment really turns against the Pinkerton Agency as armed guards.
And so that resulted in the Anti-Pinkerton Act of 1893. Could you just tell us a bit about that?
So there are these.
What did it actually do?
Not much. It's symbolic, and it's importantly symbolic. So there's this outrage after Homestead, and there are these congressional investigations. And these are tremendous documents because they interview everyone. And for the first time, I think, at least what I've seen, Congress really wants to hear from not just Pinkerton agents, not just the managers of the Pinkerton Agency. They want to hear from strikers, and they want to hear from workers, right? They want to hear that other side to the Pinkerton story. And there's outrage. There's political outrage when it comes to Homestead. And so what Congress passes in the wake of Homestead is what's called the Anti-Pinkerton Act, which is remarkable in many ways, right? If we think of this as a brand, brand that Allen had been building since the 1850s, by the 1890s, there's a bill specifically, right, targeting this company, right? The Anti-Pinkerton bill, PR disaster in numerous ways. The bill itself is very basic in that part of the outrage was not just at the existence of the Pinkertons, but this long history that not only did railroad companies and mining companies and steel companies hire the Pinkertons, but they would get deputized. So their actions were sometimes official, and sheriffs would hire them, and the Postal Service would hire them, and the Treasury would hire them, giving this veneer of officiality to the Pinkertons. And the Anti-Pinkerton bill basically says no more of this veneer of officiality. So the bill itself says the federal government cannot contract with the Pinkerton Agency or similar agencies right? The federal government cannot hire these guys to do work.
And yet they did, and all through the second half of the 19th century.
They do.
And you point out that it's a curious period of Pinkerton history because, in effect, they were paradoxically a state-sponsored vanguard of law and order on the one hand, as well as an army of plutocratic power. So the million-dollar question people must be wondering is, why did the state hide itself behind a private army for so long? And why did they fail to create their own centralized police force? And of course, what eventually did the word Pinkertonism come to mean?
I think in many ways and in many places. So in southern Indiana or the coal fields of Pennsylvania or the south side of Chicago, there's little sense, there's little faith that the state has a presence and that the state can actually enforce any kind of law and order. And so I think state officials, and state in the lowercase s sense, right? So sometimes it's the state, sometimes it's the federal government. But I think there's an understanding that many people perceive these places to be lawless, and many people perceive these places to be chaotic and violent. Some order needs to be imposed, but there are no federal actors or state actors capable of doing it, that the Pinkertons are the only option.
Right.
And so I think the state and actors in the state basically make a hard choice. And they ask themselves, is it better to have this be chaotic and to have no presence, or to have the Pinkertons do it and acknowledge that we're not capable of doing it, or have the Pinkertons do it with our blessing so that it looks like there's a state presence and order is established, and there's at least an image that these guys are official and the state exists and order exists. And I think that's the compromise they come to, that it's better to have it look like it's the state, even if it's really a private agency. It's better to have at least the myth there's the state. I think what happens by the 1890s, after Homestead, after Haymarket, after the Coeur d'Alene strike, after the range wars in Wyoming, that more and more politicians begin to understand this bargain isn't working for us anymore, that the Pinkertons aren't creating order, they're creating disorder. And our connection to the Pinkertons, our blessing, giving this official blessing to the Pinkertons, doesn't make things better, it makes it worse, right? It makes it look like we're sponsoring this, that we're responsible for it, or we're bypassing our responsibility. And so I think part of why they scale back is that the public pressure of this backlash against who the Pinkertons are, and this backlash against not just the Pinkertons, but why does Carnegie get to hire his own army and do with it whatever he wants? Kind of power.
Yeah.
And that's what Pinkertonism really comes to mean, right? It's not the Pinkertons. It's the fact that Carnegie gets to have his own army. So I think one of the things that the state comes slowly decide is that it's going to be hard, but it's better if we have an actual state agency imposing this kind of law and order than just subcontracting it to private agencies.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the New Deal of the 1930s, which is really from the 1890s through to about to the 1930s, to FDR and the New Deal. Finally, the American state is ready to battle Pinkertonism and actively ensure the civil liberties of workers against private armed guards and labor spies, while also providing a national police force. So how comprehensively did they go about this in the 1930s? Because I believe still right up until the 1930s, the Pinkertons were doing pretty good business.
They were doing tremendous business. And part of it is, as you've already pointed out, the Anti-Pinkerton bill does very little. It says the federal government can't contract, states still can. It doesn't stop Carnegie from actually hiring these guys. So it does very little. It's largely symbolic. But the outrage after Homestead was primarily about those Pinkerton guards, right? Armed Pinkerton guards, and the way in which they violently repressed strikes. And so part of the outrage and the effort to scale back Pinkertonism is to limit that. And what both Pinkerton and also these other agencies, right? There's the Baldwin Felts Agency, working
Yes.
in West Virginia who do terrible things. And in many ways, because their name isn't Pinkerton, no one notices that they're doing these terrible things.
Yes.
And so, yeah, this violence from armed guards hired by companies continues, and maybe in many ways grows through the 1920s. Right? All the Coal Wars, in deeply violent Coal Wars in West Virginia and Virginia, where Baldwin Felts is deeply involved.
Yeah, and I believe they set up a commission, the Robert La Follette Committee, rather, to investigate the Pinkertons, and basically discovers that companies like GM are paying nearly $500,000 all up. Pinkerton agents eventually testify to the committee that they'd made around $1.75 million US from some very big corporations, including GM.
And again, I think that's what really marks the 30s as different. All right, so outrage against the Pinkertons before 1930 is about their violence. All right, so these protective guards are violent. No one really worried much about that other half of the agency, right, where private detectives infiltrated groups, right, and infiltrated unions, right, the surveillance state. No one worried about that. It's not until the 30s. It's not until the rise of the CIO, the rise of the New Deal, this idea that workers are citizens too, and should have equal protection. I think the key to the La Follette Commission is that they're not investigating a single act of violence, right? So the Homestead commissions were wondered why all this violence happened at Homestead, and they were concerned about state authority and violence. The La Follette Commission is much more interested in protecting the civil liberties of workers and investigated the ways in which the Pinkertons and similar agencies, right? It wasn't just the Pinkertons. General Motors certainly pays a lot of money to the Pinkertons, but Ford creates their own agency, right? They have sort of have an in-house detectives. One of the things that La Follette Commission says is this is wrong in either way, that it's not just the violence, it's not just having armed guards, it's not just usurping the power of the state. A company can't launch clandestine investigations into its workers. And if we respect the rights of workers to unionize, which becomes law in the 30s, then companies can't thwart that through clandestine methods. And I think there's an important shift in the discourse, that it's not just Pinkerton violence that's the problem by the 30s. It's the whole surveillance state. There are surveillance methods that Pinkerton detectives represented in the 30s. It's the entirety of the Pinkertons by the 30s, because La Follette's interested in civil liberties.
Yes, and it's interesting. This is also, although the FBI had been set up in the early decade of the 20th century, by 1936, the FBI then starts to become the premier detective agency under Edgar Hoover. But one of the interesting things is, of course, he starts to professionalize the FBI in big ways. And obviously, he borrowed ideas and tactics from the Pinkerton playbook, especially on how best to promote themselves to the general public and how to control their own narratives. So, I mean, Hoover recruited white, middle-class, college-educated men who shared his politics.
Yes.
He demanded uniformity in dress and style, in particular, of course, the famous black suit and hat.
Right.
And the agents became known as the G-men, or government men, fighting against outlaws such as Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde. So it's fascinating that this transition occurs in the 30s, and this is when the FBI really starts to draw on the Pinkerton template and move center stage.
And you're absolutely right. I think you've captured an important moment, because the irony of the FBI is it's designed to replace the Pinkertons, right? To be a better alternative to the Pinkertons. But in very important ways, it replicates what the Pinkertons had done, not only in their methods and their style of dress and who they recruit, but also in that public perception, right, of winning the PR battle, of being seen as the good guys. And Hoover certainly struggles with this in the 30s. And I think there's a very interesting parallel, as you just pointed out, that Pinkerton tried to create this mythology of his detectives as the good guy, with bandits like Jesse James as the outlaw, and he kind of loses that battle. Hoover's fighting much the same battle in the 30s. You know, Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde and these other bank robbing outlaws in the 30s are deeply romantic, and in many ways, right, sort of Hoover wants his FBI to be the good guys, but he can't control that narrative. in the same ways Pinkerton couldn't control it. And in many ways, the FBI in the 30s become the villains to Dillinger's hero.
That's right. Hoover also sets up a crime records division, and I believe designed that to create good press, but also to help create a pulp detective magazine called The Public Enemy.
Right.
The thrilling exploits of the G-men. And this was, I believe, a magazine put together by, was it Courtney Riley Cooper, a journalist?
Right.
Who obviously had a close relationship with Hoover in order to be given case files to write up and embellish and, do all the rest.
In much the same way that Alan Pinkerton in the 1870s had ghosts written for him detective novels, sort of these self-aggrandizing detective novels in which he and his agents were the hero. Hoover in the 30s and 40s tries to do the same thing, right? So the G-men are the thrilling adventures of the G-men. Root for them is definitely the effort in exactly the same way.
So tell us a little bit about this new form of crime fiction that you identified, which also emerged in the 30s, that glorified the seedy, self-interested private eye, and what role Dashiell Hammett played in this new genre. Because, I mean, Hammett was a Pinkerton agent.
Yeah. Well, again, I think it goes back to Alan Pinkerton, right, is crafting this idea of what a detective is at the same time that others, like Edgar Allan Poe, is crafting this idea of what a detective is. And the detective in the 19th and early 20th century, probably best personified by Sherlock Holmes, is the educated gentleman who see things that others don't, that can deduce through logic, but can also play act, right? Can move down in society and infiltrate criminal societies if he needs to, without losing any inner morality, right? He can move through these various different substratum, but ultimately through his morality and through his intelligence and through his education, imposes law. That's the Pinkerton detective. That's Sherlock Holmes, and that's the detective of the 19th century. The 20th century detective is very different. The 20th century detective is hard-boiled, right? He's borderline criminal himself, and he's hired by seedy folks to do seedy things. There are no real heroes. They're kind of only different shades of villains. The detective himself is a kind of anti-hero. You're supposed to kind of root for him, but not that much because of the sort of dangerous world. Not only the dangerous world that he moves in, but that he lives in, right? He's very much a part of this dangerous world. And he's being asked to do terrible things and morally questionable things, but he also kind of enjoys doing these morally questionable things. That's the detective of the 30s. You'll notice, right, that's very different from what Hoover's trying to present his G-men as being.
Yeah, that's right.
The G-men are not detectives in any way, shape, or form, right? Not that kind of hard-boiled detective. But as you point out, there are a couple of key authors that help create this new hard-boiled detective, and one of them being Dashiell Hammett. And Dashiell Hammett has an interesting biography because he was a Pinkerton. He was quite literally a Pinkerton. He understood how this agency worked, and he understood the underbelly of it, the terrible things he was asked to do, the questionable methods he was asked to employ, the violence he was asked to inflict, and he becomes deeply disillusioned with this. And he has health problems as well, but he also leaves the Pinkerton agency because he doesn't really much care for this moral ambiguity that clearly has to be present for a successful Pinkerton detective. But it becomes the model by which he crafts his detective. Not so much Philip Marlowe, although Philip Marlowe has some of that, but his first detective is the nameless Continental Op. This is an operative for the Continental Detective Agency, right? It's not even all of that veiled, right? He's a cog within this big machine, and the agency tells him to go do terrible stuff, and he does terrible stuff. And he's in this mill town. And there are lots of different groups within this mill town, and there are workers, and there are some radical workers, and there's company owners, and they're all terrible. And he sort of, survives through violence. And I think the Continental Op is definitely the way in which Dashiell Hammett understood what the Pinkertons were, because he had been one.
All through your book, you stressed how the Pinkertons are so good, how Alan Pinkerton in particular was so good at controlling the narrative during times when they moved from heroes to villains. I mean, this really is a story about how culture changes, how views and perceptions change over time. It's a fascinating story. So that kind of brings me to, what can you tell us about the Pinkertons today in 2020? I mean, when did they cease being a family business? And I did have a look at their new website, and
Yeah.
of course, they have that photo with Lincoln,
Of course they do.
and Alan
Yes.
Pinkerton, but they conveniently left out the Homestead massacre.
Yes.
So I can see the control of the narrative continues to be an obsession for them.
Absolutely. So I wish I remembered this date off the top of my head, but I feel like it's in the mid 60s, I think, when it incorporates and ceases to be a family business. But by the 40s and 50s, right, so they've become a little embarrassed through these congressional hearings that their laundry gets aired, so they backtrack a little bit. They do much more private security services and their security guards, and so that they still do that business. They still do weird kinds of business. I don't know if they still do this, but for decades, they very famously provided security at the US Masters tournament, right? This golf tournament, right? So they do a lot of weird things, but they still exist. They got bought out as part of this huge conglomeration, right? So all these different security services were bought out by Securitas, this huge Swedish firm. But Securitas still maintains the Pinkerton division, right? It still exists. It still uses that name. As you saw on their website, they still market that name and market their history. They still market their connections to Lincoln. For the most part, what they provide now, I understand, is sort of private security consulting to businesses, especially American businesses working overseas. So if you're worried about company security and personal security, traveling abroad, hire Pinkerton guards. They still provide that. The other key, and this is I'm intrigued by this, right? You talked about how fascinated they still are by their own history and how they still attempt to control their history. There was a weird story about 6 months ago. There was a hugely popular video game called Red Dead Redemption 2. And in this video game, it's one of these online, you sort of play a persona and move through this video game world, and you're an outlaw, right? You're a Western bandit, and you're on the run, and you're being chased, and you have to sort of negotiate this Wild West. But you're playing the bandit, right? That's essential to the video game, and so you're kind of the hero in your own story because that's who you're playing. The villains are the Pinkertons. And the Pinkertons are trying to chase you down, right? So your job is to either keep running from the Pinkertons or to confront them or right to kill them if possible. And this became hugely popular. And the agency caught wind of this and sued. They brought a defamation suit against the video makers that this was a defamation of their brand, that presenting Pinkerton agents in the West as somehow lawless and violent and crude and thuggish was somehow an affront to their brand and counter to their business interests. So they're still hyper aware, and they're still deeply concerned about how they're presented. That suit didn't go very far, right? It was pretty easy to point out this is not a fabrication, right? There's ample evidence. Right. This is exactly what the Pinkertons did in the West. But the fact that they bothered find this video game, to find out how they were being portrayed in this video game, and to attempt to bring a suit, a defamation suit about the video game, I think does demonstrate they are still hyper aware of what their reputation and brand is.
Well, moving to the last couple of questions, I love the fact that you bring your book up to date, looking at the roles of modern security firms like Blackwater, the notorious Blackwater.
Right.
You note that it led one critic to say black is the new pink,
right?
Even though they've changed their name a couple of times at least since the bad press. But we clearly have come full circle, and the US federal government and agencies like the CIA continue to outsource and privatize security services again. I mean, this seems extraordinary to me, given that Blackwater was widely condemned for its role in the 2007 Nisour Square massacre during the Iraq War. And during those investigations, you point out that the massacre exposed the degree to which the federal government had been outsourcing services to Blackwater and a host of other private security companies. What does this tell us about the US government and the security state? And how on earth did the US government manage to get around the existing laws, the Anti-Pinkerton Act, that were meant to prevent the federal government from outsourcing to private security firms?
Those are all excellent questions. In some ways, to loop back to where we started, right? That this is you asked sort of why students should study history, right? Sort of knowing where we've been and how we got here. I think this is a great example, right?
Yes.
We've dealt with these issues before. We've asked these questions before. Maybe we haven't adequately answered them, but we've asked these questions before. I think you're right to notice that there's an ebb and flow, right? So the state contracted with the Pinkertons to have a presence in places where they felt they couldn't have a presence anyway else. And then by the progressive era through the 30s, they scaled that back and thought it's better to have an official state presence than to subcontract with private agencies. I think what we've seen since the 1990s is just the reversal of that. One of the keys to neoliberalism is for the state to provide the same things, but do so through private companies, right? Whether that's private police or private prisons or private security or mercenaries, right? This is clearly a trend, right? Blackwater is at the forefront of this, but they are not alone. This is the way in which modern governments seem to want to function, right? Sort of the privatization of public services, and I think providing law and order and providing intelligence is certainly a public service, but done so through private agencies. And Blackwater is doing much the same thing. Granted, it's a broad, although not exclusively, right? Blackwater did work within the U.S. One of the things I find intriguing about Blackwater is that Pinkerton, for so long, even still, when it comes to suing video games, defended their name, right? They were the Pinkerton Agency. Blackwater has seemed much more willing to rename itself, right, and try and move down a different path, right? Of changing, reinventing the company by reinventing. But you ask a really good question about the anti-Pinkerton law. And the anti-Pinkerton law, as we've already talked about, right, was not all that powerful to begin with, and it certainly had some loopholes and limits, and even then wasn't really obeyed all that well because the federal government still kept contracting with the Pinkertons. There have been a couple of cases where there have been questions about how much the anti-Pinkerton law still applies, right? Because it's still on the books. But when does it apply? Yes. The two key court decisions have been, one was that the courts have decided the anti-Pinkerton law was meant to curtail the use of militias. That it was the Pinkerton Agency as it existed in 1890, which meant not the detectives, but the protectives, right? The armed guards. That's what they were trying to curtail. It might not apply anymore. It might not still be relevant, the courts have said. When it comes to Blackwater, because they're clearly a militia, right? They're clearly armed guards. They're clearly a militia. Clearly applies. What the courts have said, the few times this has come up, is that they've refused to take up the question because the courts have said the cases weren't hearable because the people bringing the cases did not have standing. That you can only sue based on the anti-Pinkerton law if you were a company that were providing a similar service and a company like Blackwater got the contract instead of you through violation of that law. That's how you would have relevance to for the courts to take up this case. Just an average citizen objecting because they think it violates the law, the courts don't want to hear it. And so that's largely what they've said, which is another way of saying they're not interested in taking up the discussion.
Well, that's it. And so now the door's closed, and of course it probably continues. I mean,
it absolutely
the government,
not just with the newest version of Blackwater, but there are dozens and dozens of similar agencies, private agencies that do a lot of government contracting work. And I'm not sure without an application of the anti-Pinkerton bill, or heaven forbid, right, an outrage that comes out of some singular act of violence, the way it did out of Homestead. I'm not exactly sure without using that law how we backtrack on this increasing privatization of law.
Well, and I'm wondering whether the all these allegations made about the uprisings in the United States at the moment, Black Lives Matter.
I'm sure there are. I probably can't confirm that, but there are so many private security firms, and certainly I don't know about the most recent uprisings, but the protests against the oil pipeline throughout in North and South Dakota, there were certainly private security firms involved there. That were not just security guards, but were actively involved in surveillance and documentation and covert action and infiltration. There are undoubtedly these kinds of agencies are involved. I think the other key element that you bring up is that part of the Pinkerton playbook, going back to the Molly Maguires, is when you see disorder, find the conspiracy, right? Who are the dangerous radicals at the core of this?
Yes.
And who's behind, who's manipulating the strings to create this chaos and havoc? I think much of that fear that there are private anti-fascist radicals fomenting and shaping these uprisings sounds very similar to what Pinkerton might have said in the 1870s.
Okay, to finish up, overall, how would you assess the importance of Pinkerton Detective Agency in American popular culture? And how would you answer the question, who are those guys?
Of course, I think they're important. I think they're tremendously important. I think they're illustrative. I think part of what you see in really tracing the history of the Pinkertons is this bigger struggle of just what law and order and immigration and free speech and labor rights and civil liberties, how and what role the state plays. And when we say state, who really do we mean? I think there's such bigger issues being debated, continually being debated, whether that's Jesse James or the Molly Maguires or civil liberties in the 30s or Blackwater or Black Lives Matter. We're clearly seeing an important number of issues that the Pinkertons are right at the center of. They don't always control the ways in which that argument is being made. Sometimes they're the heroes of that argument, sometimes they're the villains of that argument, but understanding them, I think, helps us see the contours of what these bigger arguments are. So I think they're important, and I think they're important because of where they fit in that larger picture. That tough question, right? The Butch Cassidy question, who are those guys? That's the funny thing about the Pinkerton Detective Agency, because you have Alan, and you have, the other people directly under him, right? George Bangs for many years. You have his sons, William and Robert. You have some famous detectives, right? James McParland is certainly an iconic agent. But by and large, Pinkerton agents, the private Pinkerton agents, rely upon anonymity, right? They have to move in mysterious ways. And in some ways, their job is to not let us have an answer to that. We're not supposed to know who they are. They're supposed to move around in the shadows, both to do their job, which is to gather information, but also to terrify us, right? As we talked about with the surveillance state, right? This idea that eye never blinks is supposed to worry us. So I think that mystery of who are those guys is part of the mythology, part of the mystery of what the Pinkerton Agency is. And that's why there are always these key moments. There's Charles Siringo, who is a Pinkerton agent who wrote this amazing expose. There's Dashiell Hammett, right? When there are these moments when there are Pinkerton agents who sort of step out of the shadows and sort of peel back the edges for us, are these fascinating moments, right? When they tell us, well, here's who they are. And part of what they tell us is that they're across the board, right? Who the detectives are, who the armed guards are, who's breaking strikes. It's a vast array of different people reinventing not just how law and order works, but also making a lot of money while doing it.
Okay, well, look, Paul, thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, and thank you for sharing so many highlights of your wonderful book, Inventing the Pinkertons. And I really enjoyed it. It's one of those books that is so densely packed with facts and information and insights and lots of wonderful footnotes where you can find a lot of additional information. It's a wonderful book, and congratulations for having it published, and we all look forward to your next project, whatever it is.
Thank you so much. I very much enjoyed my time here, and I appreciate your work on it and all the stuff that you're doing. So thank you so much.